Hi, welcome to Fiberchats. My name is Irina. I'm the host here. My guest today is Aleks Byrd. Hi, Alex. Welcome.
Hi, Irina. Thank you for having me.
Lovely to meet you finally. I mean, I've been a long time fan of yours, like watching all the things that you designing. And I must like the thing that like catches my eyes that like it looks traditional in some sense, but it's very unusual. And you've been concentrating on Estonian knitting. So I know that your mom's side of the family is from Estonia and your grandma was a master knitter in Estonia. Tell me about growing up in a family that's like that creative.
Sure. Yes. So my mom's side of the family are all Estonian. They are all creatives. So I have lots of cousins who are interior designers, ceramic artists, jewelers, interior architects. My grandmother was a cook, so she wrote a lot of recipes for magazines, but in her kind of spare time she knit, and she really really loved Estonian lace, so she did a lot of lace shawls. She did some color work as well. She wasn't knitting the time that I knew her because she wasn't well, but we have a whole oak trunk of all of her shawls and things that she knit for my mum and my uncle. So I always grew up with lots of kind of creative things around from various relatives, and that was kind of part of just the background. My mom always was doing creative things. That wasn't her job, but that was what she enjoyed in her spare time. So that was kind of always around me, and I kind of just sucked it in like a sponge. My mom taught me to knit when I was 8, but I didn't really love it. She kind of taught me in a way that's not unlike most Estonians of just go straight in, and I got to pick the yarn and everything completely unguided and picked chenille, which was a bad choice, but I persevered. I and an 8-year-old thinks soft and shiny, perfect, and jumped in. But it kind of I took a pause. I grew up in the US. It wasn't so exciting being the only really 8-year-old in my school who learned to knit. So I didn't pick it up till high school again, and then just kind of fell down the rabbit hole of like learning the techniques that a lot of my family knew in Estonia, and kind of reading. We collect a lot of books. My mom has loads of books. I now have a lot of books, and they were books that were collected by my family and things we've purchased, which are some are quite old, which is what I still use now, that cover all the techniques and the rich history that we have in Estonia. So kind of all comes together in that
Right.
way.
It's one thing to learn how to knit, right? Or even as a teenager to like experiment with different knitting techniques. Do you remember like that moment when you consciously got interested in Estonian knitting specifically?
Yes, I was probably around the first time I got to go to Estonia. So I didn't go until I was quite late. I grew up speaking Estonian at home, and I went to kind of like an Estonian reading group on weekends. But I didn't go until I was, I think, maybe 13, 14 was the first time I went. And we went around seeing family there, and we my family's quite close to a lot of other very influential artists and textile artists, and one of them, she put out a book on, they're like little color work animals.
Mhm.
So kind of how to use traditional color work patterns on gloves and things, but how to make like little animals, so dogs and things. And they're also hand puppets. So that was the first time I went, I want to make this. And my mom said, okay, fine, here's some yarn, here's some needles, go. And that was the first time I did color work. I was just so focused, I wanted to make that. So that was kind of a starting point. I didn't kind of put 2 and 2 together in terms of designing and playing beyond the confines of something already done until probably, I don't know, a good 6, 7 years later. In terms of kind of reading more books, but it was kind of the gateway. And then I just started going through all the books, and that was also about the time I was in university studying illustration graphic design. So I was already kind of designing other things. And so I went, oh, well, why not play with knitting and use all the books that are scattered around
Yeah.
and read up on it a bit more? Because I do like books and doing a bit of research. So it feels that kind of nerdy
Well, when
and
you look at the books, like knitting books from specifically from like Eastern Europe, it's like more, I find like it's more, almost like a rule. The instructions are like very minimal. Like they sort of assume that you know your stuff and you don't need the exact explanations and step by step. So like if you are a new knitter or if you like didn't grow up with those traditions, it's often frustrating. Did you find that in your research as well?
a bit. I would say it's kind of one of those things. I grew up with both cultures, so I get it from the Estonian side and I get it from kind of like the outside kind of Western approach. In Estonia, most of my family that stayed there, they all learned to knit in school. That was like a class. They learned to do all the things. And I've actually taken classes from some of the actual master knitters there. And some of the other students, I'll call them students, are actually knitting teachers. So there's quite a high bar. So a lot of the way the books have written and even patterns there is the assumption you should already know what you're doing. So I'm just giving you the absolute bare minimum. Like if it's a sock, this is the number of stitches, knit the thing, turn the heel, done. Like read in between the lines. And that's kind of typical of like Eastern Europe and even Scandinavia. It's
Right.
starting to change. So kind of the way I write my patterns is kind of making it a bit of a bridge. So there is a lot of, I read the books. Most of these books are not available in English. So I have quite a collection of very old books. There's a lot of trial and error, even because some of the old ones, you kind of have to keep trying it until it works. And then with all the yarn that we have, it's different from what was traditionally used. So it's a lot of playing around. And what I do tends to be a little bit of a hack. So still the old, but how to use the newer yarns and make it slightly easier as well.
Well, I wanted to talk to you. We talked a little bit about before we started this interview, but I wanted to talk to you a little bit about cultural expropriation and the whole idea of like certain techniques and certain traditions belonging to that specific country. And of course, you sort of belong because you have Estonian roots, but one may argue that you are not really an Estonian knitter and yet you like showing the traditional Estonian knits, right? How do you decide for yourself, like how to honor the traditions, but also keep them alive and keep them new and fresh? Because like otherwise it's all disappears on us.
Sure. I think it's one of those things from the outside, a lot of people will go, you're not really Australian. Within Australians, if you grow up, you speak the language, I have a passport and all, there's not as much difference. So every Estonian's an Estonian, regardless of where you're born. So we're spread out quite a bit. So I haven't had any issues using, I work a lot with actually the master knitters in Estonia. So there's a lot of collaboration on it and kind of checking in that everything's good. So and it's kind of bringing people in. A lot of the younger generation, so like my generation, they learn in school and then they go, nah, I don't feel like knitting. It was really strict. Teacher was really strict. I don't really feel like it. So it's trying to bring them back in and also sharing the information in a way that's accessible to the outside world, but kind of pulling people into being intrigued about learning more about Estonian knitting. I'm really happy to share it. The master knitters there are quite pleased about sharing it, as long as we kind of acknowledge where things are from. So I work a lot with the most prominent one is roosimine, so the inline knitting technique. So I work with the ladies that come from the parish where it's from, the Stama, including the one master knitter who brought it back on Urandma. So I work a lot with her and we kind of speak quite often. And, you know, it's making it kind of known and acknowledging where they are. So people can kind of go, oh, if I visit, maybe I'll go check that out. I'm a knitter. Um, and I teach this in workshops. So there are loads of other knitters who take my workshops, or other designers even. And I think if you're using a technique, as long as you acknowledge the name of it and where it's from, I think it's completely fine, because everything evolves. There's always something new. Nothing's purely original. So I think, things evolve. I mean, I'm not knitting it the exact traditional style of like tiny, tiny needles that are like a US 0 or a 2 millimeter and smaller. I'm knitting it on larger needles. So there's always going to be variation. But I think it's acknowledging kind of where it started from and how we're kind of changing it with the changing fashions and the yarn and the colors. I think there's room. There's room for everybody.
I mean, I deeply agree with you, just because I feel like if, it's like fashion changes, everything changes. So it's like, and with the world becoming more and more global and smaller, it's sort of like incorporates all these different techniques, but it's traditionally also how that happened, like originally, ages ago, because people would becoming salespeople, or travelers from different parts, and they would share something new. They would bring some new needs, and people would study it and figure out that some little thing that they like, and they would incorporate it into their knitting. So I feel like it always was sort of evolving and changing. So there is nothing wrong with continuing to evolve it. And
I did my master's. I did a master's degree in textiles, and actually my kind of overall project was kind of collaging different techniques and mostly patterns from kind of Nordic Europe, so the Baltics, including Estonia, all the way across to Shetland. And I did a whole thing of tracing the most common pattern, which is an 8-point star. And you see it everywhere, but everybody's got like a slight variation. There's slight take on it, but we're all connected in some way. It's just a slight variation that we make it our own.
Well, Estonian knitting is also like very regional. It's like very divided, depends on which village you're in. There's like different little motifs and different techniques. How do you decide what catches your attention? Like, how do you decide which technique you're gonna showcase in your designs?
I don't always have a formula or plan to it. With like traditional knitting, there's like you knit for what your region is. My family is somewhat, in terms of where they are from, is spread out. So like even we have national costumes. I have 3, all of which are not actually where my family is from, but I've collected a couple of different ones. And so when it comes to the things that I use in patterns, it's generally kind of placing them what kind of speaks for it. I use them a lot as I say very kind of a bit of embellishment. So it's adding an extra touch. And what I love with when I talk about Estonian knitting a lot, even in workshops, is it's customizing it. When you look at Estonian knits, so like mittens and gloves, which are quite common, and you can see exactly what parish it's from, because the color palette, the pattern, the techniques will tell you precisely. But even with that, within that, there's variation. So you can tell almost the knitter who made it, because they've put like a slight variation on it. So when I look at using techniques, it's mostly adding really kind of clever and thought out details. So whether it's just like a bit of fringe, like just to give it a little bit of a nice finish, or a braid. So it's not necessarily thinking, oh, I'm going to make a certain look, but it's just like very thought out details, which is a lot of what culturally we've done, is kind of everything's embellished, but it's always like thoughtfully done, and just kind of like a little bit of like added enhancement.
Well, let me get into that head of yours. How those ideas even come to you? Like it's like the chicken or the egg, right? Do you have a silhouette first? Do you feel like, oh, today I'm gonna make a cowl? Do you see some design? Do you see some technique? Like, how does it usually work?
It kind of goes a couple of different ways. Oftentimes it's just like a pattern, like a stitch pattern comes to mind. and I usually scribble it down, and then I'll swatch it, and then it will say I want to be something big, like a sweater or a cardigan, or it can be smaller. Usually everything for me starts on paper. I'm quite analog, so it's always on paper, lots of pens, colored pencils, always on paper, lots of grid paper around. And then I move into the yarn. In terms of the inspiration, it's kind of a mix of different things. So I usually have like loads of books around. There's probably like a stack of books pretty much in every room. And they kind of change in terms of what groupings I've put them in. And they're mostly kind of some of the books I have in my collection that have traditional patterns and techniques. And I've kind of flagged them going, that's an interesting one. I'll figure out what I'm going to try, what yarn I'm going to try with that. So I have books, then I've got loads of photos, kind of collections of things. So I stick on like cork boards. So I've got one back there, I've got one in front of me that are covered with things that kind of rotate around. And those kind of, it kind of collages together. But I always start on paper, and I'm usually sometimes even cutting it up if it's color work patterns. So like on a cowl like this, I've done like each of those color work charts separately and then just cut them up and physically moved them around until I got a placement that I liked. And then I'll swatch. So usually it's paper, then a swatch, then to the finished thing. That tends to be usually the method, but sometimes I have like a silhouette in mind that usually gets stuck on the board. So I do look quite a bit online in terms of kind of like, what are people wearing? What do I like that catches my eye? Sometimes even when I'm walking by a shop and I go, I really like that sweater, but I might do something completely different, but the shape is really nice.
Well, when it comes to Estonian knitting, like to me, that thing behind you, that sleeve, looks
Yeah.
extremely complicated. I mean, this is like the technique that it looks like embroidery, but
Yeah.
actually knitting. Do you have like a favorite technique? Is there something that you like always come back to and you keep on changing things around, but like it's you coming back to the same thing?
I kind of go through phases where I get really obsessed with one thing and it's just on absolutely every project. And then it rotates around. So I have a really hard time going like, do I have an absolute favorite? Because I feel like that's shaming the others, but it's not really. I would say probably the one that I come back to is Rosimina. I always refer to it as deceptively easy. I would say pretty much all the techniques that I have, they're deceptively easy. They look a lot harder than they are to do. This one, it's just there's a lot of possible, you can really have fun with it. Different yarns behave differently, and kind of the placement, you know, how big, how small you make it. That's probably my favorite that I go back to again and again. That being said, I do go through phases. So like I've been in a bit of like a knit fringe phase, and then braids. I like putting braids on kind of edgings. They keep it from curling and it just looks a little bit nicer
I love
than just,
the look of the braids. Like
yeah.
absolutely love it. I don't love the whole twisty and twisty thingy that's
I
happening with it.
know, I know. It's the small price that you have to pay. Certain ones will untwist if you persevere. I am not that patient person, so I am usually like spinning mine to untwist. It's a small price. That's the only downside with it. Like I will say this one is like super easy. There's no twisting. It's great for using leftover yarn because it doesn't use a lot. So that's probably like the nicest and easiest. I also call it kind of cheat intarsia. I don't really like intarsia, and this is way easier than doing intarsia.
I have to give it a try. Like I'm
It's
just
way
like so
easier than
fascinated.
intarsia. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I get a lot of people who have knit intarsia and they take my class and they're like, oh, you are right, that is easier. And I'm like, it is easier. So much easier.
Is it
So
difficult to grade it because you do a lot of garments? Like, is it difficult when it comes to color work and all those?
I
motivate?
spend a lot of time grading. I think I have a couple of friends who are designers as well, and I spend a lot of time grading because I want it to fit well. I will say sometimes they're easier than others. The Rosina ones tend to, for the most part, be okay, because I'm not usually repeating them around, so they're kind of more like intarsia than color work. Some cases the pattern is repeated all the way around. So usually it's okay. I'm working on something now that's being a little bit difficult, but persevere.
Well, I
um,
want to ask you about that. So, like, as a designer, like, this is your job now, right? You treat it as a business. It's not a hobby any
absolutely.
longer. There is this whole like balancing act of, if you make something easy that more people can do it, you sell more patterns. If you go for your artistic ambitions and you go for like what, you know,
Yeah.
plays on your heartstrings, right? You might have absolute masterpiece on your needles, but not too many people can do that. How do you decide what you're gonna go after?
It's a balance. So I tend to go look at it from like what I personally am aware, because most of the time I end up being the model for all the photos. So there's a little bit of that, but also I kind of look at the people who are around me. So like even in the knit groups that I go to, of like, what are people knitting? What are they gravitating towards? Like when it's something like a sweater or cardigan, what are they looking at in terms of knitting and wearing? So it's kind of a blend between what I personally like and what other people will wear. In terms of how easy it is to knit, I will say I generally try not to make it hard. So with a pattern, usually it's about 2 techniques maximum that I'm adding. So like something like the Sally, which has the kind of, what I'll say, newer things that someone might come across is the rosingana and the braids, and that's like enough. And that there's plenty of just like plain stockinette. So there's a fine balance of it not being too much, but just enough that you're engaged in it, but it'll still be quite wearable. So it's kind of finding that happy medium, because I also look at it going, if it's me knitting it for fun, you don't want to be having to concentrate
Right.
24/7 on the pattern. You should enjoy knitting it. I knit still most of my samples. I do have some help. And I go, if I'm really not enjoying this, then no one else is. So usually I kind of go, this isn't going well. Maybe that's something that shouldn't end up being published. So there's a lot of kind of thought. And I usually ask questions. I love going to festivals as well and seeing what people have knit and kind of getting that idea, because I think oftentimes, well, during COVID, you're kind of in your bubble. And so you only see kind of what's around you. So it's really nice to see what everybody's knitting, and there's so much variation. So it's kind of finding the happy balance. And I do, when I'm looking at adding things, I do look at kind of what other people have knit and post on Instagram, and kind of what are in magazines, and kind of they get put on my board. So I have kind of ideas of silhouettes. They might not get used immediately, but they're in the background to kind of be absorbed and pulled on.
Is there like ever creative block in your life when you don't know what to do next or where to go?
Yeah. I have definitely had that. I think when I finished a big project, so like I put out a book, and that kind of was like my life for a very large chunk. And then I was like, okay, I need a break. I can't. And then it's like mindless knits. I just was like, I just need to almost not do anything and wait for it to come back. But I've had creative blocks a few times. It's mostly after like finishing a really big project, a big release, and you kind of just have to shut off and go, I don't need to put something out there. I feel like a lot of people see knitting patterns and they go, oh, well, it's just come out. And there's a lot of work that goes on behind this. It's like, it's not just a month's work, it's like several months. And so sometimes you just have to shut off and go like, okay, no one needs to like see something new constantly being posted or added. Like just take a break and kind of reset. But I've definitely had it. Um, it gets better over time. You kind of recognize when you're getting close to that point and you go, okay, time to stop before we get there.
Do you ever feel burnout?
Yeah, I've been burnt. I would say the creative blocks have happened. I've been burnt out. I think I've only had 2 really bad burnouts. And those are frustrating because you kind of want to be doing something, but you can't, or what you've put when you force it doesn't come out being as good. So you kind of have to just go, okay, it's not working. Don't push, don't try pushing it too hard. I find if I push too hard and I try to rush something, it tends not to be as good quality
Right.
in the long run. And when you kind of look at it, when we look at kind of like a portfolio of patterns, they're usually the ones when I look at it go like they stand out like a sore thumb, and they often don't do as well. So it's kind of a constant reminder and lesson of like, don't rush it. If it's good,
Well, do
sometimes
you
it's worth
ever
it.
get like the opposite thing when you think you created an absolute masterpiece and there's crickets of the react, like nothing, like the world just didn't notice?
Uh, on occasion, I think I try not to think that I'm as big a designer as some people would probably put me as. Like, I'm still very much like in shock on the whole kind of like celebrity factor of it. So I try and not invest too much. Granted, I will check like, you know, how is it doing, but I don't get too upset. Sometimes or if I have, I've gone, is it worth getting upset over this one thing? Most of the ones that have done well have kind of surprised me because they're not necessarily the ones that I pick, and then I go, okay, obviously I need to rethink what people actually like of my stuff, which is not a bad thing. I like being surprised, and it's a good challenge of going like, okay, so people really like this, so I have to take that in mind. I've had a few things where they haven't gone as well, and I'm kind of now looking back on it and going like, oh, maybe that's a pattern I might revisit and go, what, like I love the stitch pattern, why didn't it do well? Maybe I need to do something different. Oftentimes it's trying to tell someone that they can do it. I meet a lot of knitters who go, I really love your pattern, but I don't think I can do it. Or they've been told by someone else, I think that's beyond your skills. And I spend more time going, it's not. If you know how to knit and purl, you can absolutely do this. Like, I'm not showing you, I'm not inventing the wheel. It's easy. It just looks hard. So I think that's my realization now is a lot of patterns, sometimes people go, I want the instant gratification of doing it, but they just go, I don't know if I can. I don't know if I can. So I spend a lot of time now making tutorial videos. So I do teach a lot of workshops, but doing videos and kind of like repeating things a couple times and actually learning different ways that people knit. So I'm more of a continental knitter. I now knit English style or throwing style because I live predominantly in the UK. So most people here knit that way. I taught in Portugal. I had to figure out how Portuguese knitting worked, which
Right.
was really an interesting challenge to then apply onto how to do like a knitted braid, Portuguese style. So I think most of the patterns that haven't done well for me, it's not necessarily they were bad. I'd like to not think they were bad, but I think people just are scared. And it's kind of just making it go like, it's not that scary. You can do it.
Right.
Just try. It's
Well,
all
I
good.
noticed like a lot of your patterns in the description, you just say it's for like adventurous beginner or like beginner friendly. How do you know when to stop explaining? Like, because it seems to me like when you invite everybody to join you, right, in
Yeah.
something that people perceive as complicated, and you want to show them that it's beginner friendly, you have to like spill out like every single detail, you know, there. How do you stop yourself from over explaining, or how do you make sure that you explained enough?
I think it's a bit of a challenge. I've learned definitely over time. I think having taught people, so starting off just like being at my local knit group and someone going, I need help with a pattern. It might not be mine, and just going like, okay, how do you get that person to where they need to be? And then teaching workshops, and also just loads of questions. I will say, like, I have really great test knitters, and then even people who have knit released patterns who emailed me with questions, and they might not be things that I've thought of previously. It's kind of understanding not how I knit, but just putting myself in someone else's shoes, a different knitter, and going like, okay, how are you approaching this with what I've given? Have I given you enough, or is it too much that you're confusing it? With the videos, I think what I tend to do is break things up. So yes, I could make one video on how to do this technique with like all the elements. It'd probably be an hour long, because I usually do like a 2-hour virtual or a 3-hour in person. No one wants to watch like my hands for an hour. So it's breaking it up into bite-sized pieces, and people can kind of go, okay, I'll watch this for however long they need, and then they can step away. Or if they need to watch longer, they can watch longer. But also making it accessible. So for me, learning how other people knit, so learning English and Portuguese style, and just going, okay, let me try and figure it out from your point of view, because the way the traditional one was method, and the way that it's written is everybody knits the same way. You just do this. And nobody knits the same way, which I think is beautiful. I always approach things of like, there's no right or wrong way. Even with the way I do it, there's no right or wrong. It's just another way of doing it. So making it bite-size, people can pick and choose how much they need, how much hand holding. It's a little bit easier with the videos. When you get into like writing things out, that's always kind of a fine balance. For the most part, I kind of pick the middle route of like just enough text, but I'm not going to give you like a whole long saga, because I don't want my patterns to be like 10 plus pages that you have to print out, because I personally I don't like that when I'm doing someone else's pattern, because I like printing out and scribbling on printed sheets. So
Well, when you look back at your journey in this whole thing, right? So like you went from just playing with that knitted toy with the traditional design,
yeah.
into like going full-blown designer, now instructor, and now book author. Do you think you were brave? Do you think you were naive and you just didn't know what you're getting into? Like, what's your feeling about your journey?
I would say both. Naive in that I didn't know, like I come from a very creative background and approach to it, and I don't necessarily like following the rules. So when I knit someone else's pattern, which is kind of how I got into designing, was I wanted to change the colors. So I just did that and colored the chart myself, and then went down, naive in that I didn't quite know what I was getting into. And I just kind of kept going, I'll figure it out. I'll figure it out. There's a lot of maths. I did not, as someone who's not a math lover, I've had to kind of embrace that, embrace that and embrace spreadsheets, and spend time with that. Whereas I'd like to just play with colors and pens and yarn. But I would say brave. Like I look at it now going like, I put out a really large book, and that was something I had in my head. And then when it happened, it was like, this has happened. I have put myself out there, and it's scary and exciting, and you just hope that people like it. And that's kind of just taking a leap, going like, I've done this, I don't know how it's going to be received, and let's hope it's good, because I've had a lot of love and time and effort into it. So it's definitely both. It's gone from naive to now brave. I would say, like, I can't say I'm naive anymore, but I started off naive and switched to brave. And I'm hoping to hold on to the brave going forward, going like, okay, I've done this. Like each stepping stone that I've done, like every pattern I've put out, I've learned something. I've pushed myself that, yeah, I can keep going and bring other people and go like, you're brave too. You can try a new technique. You can learn something else, add to your toolbox.
Are you a planner, like in general? Do you plan like all the patterns that's going to be released the next year? Like, do you have everything planned for 2023?
I would like to say I am. I am ambitious in that I go, I'm going to do this. 2023 has certain things have been planned. So I'm kind of doing a couple of like themed months, definitely participating this October a little bit more. But I don't always have like a concrete plan of like this many sweaters for the year. This because sometimes I don't have like things just kind of happen in the moment. Usually like a yarn will just appear in a shop that I see or something, and I'm like, I have to have this, something, it's going to become something. So yes and no. This year's a little bit more planned, but I don't have like it precisely, because sometimes things need a little bit longer. I think I've learned that lesson doing books and things, that sometimes it takes a little bit longer with the test knitting or a little bit longer with the grading just to get it to fit right, to read well. So don't I'm kind of learning to become a bit more of a planner, but not quite there yet.
Well, you have like I'm just trying to like imagine your day-to-day life, right? Like you have to write the pattern, you have to swatch the sketch the pattern, swatch the pattern, find the proper yarn, which I'm sure it's not always the right yarn for what you had in mind, and you have to try it again, and then you have to knit it, and then you have to grade it, and then you have to find testers, and then you have to answer all their questions, and mistakes come up, and you have to redo stuff, and then you have to publish it, and then you have to answer all the questions of people who bought the pattern, and meanwhile you're teaching, and
No.
meanwhile you're writing a book. I mean, it sounds like you are a busy girl. Do you ever need for yourself a pleasure for just, you know, entertainment?
Yes, it's mostly if I'm like taking vacation. So like over Christmas, New Year's, I knit a sweater, not something that I designed, yarn that I had bought just for it. I knit an Easy V by Caitlin Hunter. I was like, I'm just gonna knit this. It's gonna be a fun knit. And so occasionally I do that. I've been knitting now some like mindless knits to donate for a couple of charities, handing out warm knits for Ukraine, just for the sheer pleasure of just knitting. And it's nice not having to think about it and go, oh, did that stitch count match up? Should I have done this? Because I'm someone who my friends will say is a bit of a perfectionist. So if it's not quite right, I will like fudge and rewrite and all of that until it's right for when it goes to publish. So whoever's buying it gets like the perfect pattern. Well, hopefully closest to perfect.
Well, how do you deal with mistakes? Like if, let's say you publish the pattern and mistake shows up.
I'm terrible in that I'm very frustrated with myself going, oh no, this has happened. I usually have to take like a little bit of a break and then go, okay, we'll fix it. With Ravelry, that's quite easy. Just put out a new pattern, and I do all my layouts myself, so I can just quickly pop it up. And I usually put a note of like, it's been updated, there was an error X. Be very transparent about it. It's something I've gotten better over time with, of going like, nothing's absolutely perfect. And even if it's perfect for me, that doesn't mean someone else might read it and go, I don't understand the way you're writing. And like, it takes a bit of time. So the aim is to make it as clear as possible, that I get as few emails with questions. That's kind of the like slightly the game that I play of like, how clear can I make this? I'm really, really lucky that I have a good pool of test knitters and some who are very, very detail oriented and highlight and like underline, make really detailed notes more so than I even do on my own when I'm writing it. So that usually helps. But
Well,
yeah.
describe me your ideal tester. Like, how do you pick testers, and what do you appreciate? What qualities do you appreciate in testers?
Oh, so I have basically an open, like anyone can sign up to be a tester. The ones that are really good are, it's kind of, you kind of want to mix. So I want people of different kind of knitting backgrounds and things, because you want to make sure that the pattern can be read by a large group of people. So, you know, I will always take someone who's maybe never knit one of my patterns or never tried a technique, because it's a good kind of, can you get on with this pattern? And also people who are knitting with a variety of different yarns. So I have testers who are all over the globe and they all use different yarn and they bring to a pattern something completely different. I've had people who color block when I've not thought of color blocking, and that really excites me. They actually sometimes inspire me what I should be doing next, going like, oh, you've put that and that together. I would not have done that, but great. I do appreciate the ones who are a bit detail oriented. So I have some who are, particularly when it comes to like knowing yarn quantities, everybody's using different yarns. So kind of making sure, I tend to sometimes with my patterns give a little bit extra. So you're not playing yarn chicken, because I don't like playing yarn chicken. So it's better to have a little bit extra. But yeah, I think I have like a balance of testers. So some who are very detail oriented, they print out, they'll like send me pictures of like, I found an error and they've like circled it. And then I have some who just send me general questions of going, have you thought about doing it this way? It's mostly like people asking questions. So I think of like my testers, it's kind of like a little community. So they ask me questions and we kind of go back and forth, and it's getting the end result to being as best as it can. And I always say they're part of the process, making it the best pattern it can be and making sure everyone can knit it and being kind of the proof. A lot of them are also vouching, being like, it's really not that hard to knit, which is always great. They're like, I knit it, it's the first thing I ever tried. So that's always great. So I tend to like have quite a varied pool of testers.
Well, you mentioned that you like going to festivals. How disciplined are you with your yarn purchases? Do you always buy for a project that you have in mind, or just the color or the texture? Like, how do you buy yarn, and what's your yarn stash looks like?
My yarn stash looks like a bit of a mess at the moment. I've been like trying to organize it, which is, I don't know how well that's going. I think it might be winning and I'm losing. I in the past was very undisciplined and just, I think like most kind of knitters going to like their first few festivals of, I'm just buying loads of yarn, and then you've got like lonely skeins as you've just bought one of this and one of that, and you go, what do I do now? I am slightly more disciplined in that if I'm going, not always do I have a plan in mind. Sometimes I look at it and go, that color's really nice, and that fiber blend would work with this technique or that technique. And so I tend to look at it and go, do I feel like this is a sweater or is it something else? So I'll buy like 3 or more skeins of something. So I'm not ending up with lonely skeins that I'm then going, oh no, now I need more of because I've decided something else. So it's gotten slightly more defined, but it's not perfect. I have my weaknesses, but I kind of now know a little bit more, having kind of knit enough and designed enough patterns, what I generally knit or design. So I knit more sweaters than I used to. So I tend to buy more sweater quantities. And if I'm knitting accessories, I can kind of know I need roughly this much. So if I have some lonely skeins, okay, what can I pair it with? I'm trying to organize my stash and go like, oh, I have some like skeins. What am I doing with this? And grouping stuff together, because I would like to have it smaller than it is.
Well, do you
I think
ever look at yarn and get inspirations? Like when you look at your stash and you're like, oh, I forgot I have this skein. How about I'll make this?
yes, I actually have the one that's currently a grading problem at the moment was that I had yarn in my stash and I went, oh, that went with something I bought while I was doing a book tour. It's like, oh, those two go together. Okay, great. I can do something now. It was otherwise just sitting there. Actually, this one was from Edinburgh Yarn Festival, which was the second one I went to, a little bit more disciplined. And that started off literally just had a skein of each color going, okay, I'm going to do something, but I'm going to test it. So for the most part, I kind of go with plan. I am looking at my stash a bit more, and sometimes it's going, okay, maybe I need one other thing to add to this to kind of pull it in. And I've kind of gotten into kind of mixing yarns a little bit more now. Everyone's into mixing yarns and playing with that. So
Do
I
you have
kind
a
of look at
plan
my
for wog knitting? Like you coming to wog knitting next week? Right?
fortunately, I mean, good and bad. I don't have a lot of time to shop because I'm teaching quite a bit. Also, it's a function of how much I can actually fit in my suitcase back. So it's like, uh, there are certain things that I've seen pop up, and I'm like, oh, I really like that color. I think if I'm buying anything, it will probably be for 3 types of projects. So I do a lot of like mittens, fingerless mitts. So something like that, socks, or probably not socks. Socks are good actually. I have planned socks this year. So it'll probably be mittens, like a shawl, and a sweater. I've got like a few things sketched out of like silhouettes, so those might be allowed to be purchased.
Well, I want to ask you about that word that majority of knitters horrified by swatching. Tell me
I
about your relationship with swatching, because I know you do swatch a lot. You did tons of swatching for the book. What's your relationship with it?
It's grown over the years. I used to hate swatching because I thought, oh no, I'm using up yarn that I could be using for the sweater. And I used to rip out my swatches because I didn't want to play yarn chicken. And I also didn't want to have just a random square sitting around. I have changed my mind about swatching. I think partly, so when I moved to the UK to do a master's, I had to swatch everything that I thought of to present for my degree, and I ended up with a ridiculous amount of swatches, and I was slightly horrified to begin with. And then I went, oh, actually, this is quite nice because if I don't use it for this design, it can just sit. Like if that yarn wasn't quite right, but I like the stitch pattern, like the idea was there. So I've come around to it. So the book, I think somebody asked me how many swatches there are and what I've done with them. And I think I probably had easily like 40 swatches, and not even all of the ideas for that ended up in the book. A lot got cut and they will get used sometime later on in a different way. And I've thought about making a blanket with it. I don't know. But I have a lot of swatches. I've come to love it. I appreciate it. I think it's slightly different when you're designing. I do swatch when I'm knitting someone else's pattern. I don't always keep said swatch. Sometimes I
But
do.
what in the swatch, right? Because like when people think swatching, they just think size. What else can you learn from swatching?
So I do it with, I actually might, I'll pull down. I've got like a couple of swatches that are the same pattern, but it's different yarn. So these are like the same, essentially the same swatch. They're essentially the same swatch, but different yarn. And I can kind of test out the colors, but also the fabric. Same with these. They're the same pattern, slightly different. So I'll swatch even the same thing with different yarn. Like with this technique, I found like I'm trying different yarns that aren't traditional because there are loads of different yarns on the market and playing with different weights and fiber blends, and some it doesn't work, it's too heavy. I've done a certain garment, and had I done it again, I would have changed it because it just like it grew because the yarn was too heavy. So I'll swatch a million different times, look at the wrong side, the right side. I've come to love it. I'm still not good when I'm swatching when it's kind of just like selfish knitting. So if it's someone else's pattern, I do swatch, I do block it. I am good in that respect. But sometimes I do rip it out unless I intend to keep kind of a note of that yarn that I want to revisit it and go like, oh, okay, I tried knitting that and I really liked the way that felt. Okay, I'll keep kind of that swatch. So it depends, but I do like swatching in that you get an idea for it, of how it's gonna feel in the end.
Right.
I'm a little bit of a stickler when it comes to like color work. Some people I will swatch them around, but if it's you're swatching to test out your colors, I tend to actually color. So all of my patterns that have color have the charts to color in, because I think if you start there, if it doesn't work on paper, it won't work in the yarn.
Well, I mean,
So
that's like another question, because like this is probably the most difficult thing I find about any kind of color work,
yeah.
coming up with combinations. Where do you draw inspirations for that? Like, do you go for traditional colors, Estonian traditional colors, or do you come up with just your favorite combinations? How do you decide?
Both. So I will say I use some that are traditional, not completely, and then some are just like opposite ends complete. Like some I'll put a neon in or just a completely different combo. So like that's got like a faded brighter color. When it comes to choosing color, sometimes I'll look at photos that I've taken, and usually I take so many photos of random things and I go, oh, those colors look really nice. I'm going to take a photo of that and save it and maybe use that to kind of reference going like, oh, I really liked that. If I see yarn that matches, that's something for a project. Sometimes if there's a yarn that I love and I know I want to use it, I will literally kind of play within the palette of going like, well, I tend not to knit things with just one color. It's a rare occasion. There's usually at least two or three. So I tend to kind of play around. But I always, if I'm trying to match it with a stitch pattern, I'm usually there with colored pencils going like, okay, let me test this. I might need to switch this around. And that's often how I kind of tell people if you're really unsure, like adult coloring for knitting, like just color it. Like it will help you kind of see it without going, I'm gonna cast on and then find out partway through, I hate this. I rip it all out.
Right. Do you think there is another book in the works?
There is. I've been asked. I have a couple of ideas for multiple books, but at the moment I'm trying to solidify one or two. But yeah, there are more books. I loved working on the book that came out, Traditions Revisited. I loved doing that. It was a lot of work, but I loved it of using like absolutely every skill I have in one thing, and I just love print as well. So yeah, there are more books than me. It's a question of when, but they will happen for sure.
Well, I hope to see you next week at Vogue, and it was a pleasure to get to know you a little bit here.
Oh, I've so enjoyed it. Thank you for having me.
Thanks, Alex. Thank you for being a guest of my channel.